advocacy for Pacific priorities at the UN. I think so. That's really, in a nutshell, the work that I do at the forum. But and I've been in this role for 3 years. Prior to coming to Fiji, I worked in my home country of Papua New Guinea as a researcher, mainly researching issues relating to gender-based violence. Thank you, Talei.
So before I go into questions, I just wanted to delve more into your background. Can you just tell us where you come from in Papua New Guinea and the research that you were working on before you came to Fiji?
So I come from East Sepik, which is in the northern part of Papua New Guinea. It's about an hour, just over an hour by plane from Port Moresby, but I was born and raised in Port Moresby, the capital of PNG, and I'm an anthropologist by training.
And what made you focus on gender in your research?
I think I came around gender in a roundabout way, to be honest. So I've always had a keen interest in causes of violence, especially gender-based violence. Not because of my own experience of violence. I grew up in in a home where I didn't ever experience violence, as in domestic violence between my parents. And so, but I grew up also with very mindful that there was a lot of violence going on around me. And I've always been interested to understand why people turn to violence. And as part of that, when I began my career as a researcher, I sort of went into looking at those issues, and by default, ended up sort of looking at broader issues relating to gender, especially around women's leadership in Papua New Guinea, especially looking at women's political leadership. But that's really been my focus of work as a researcher for many years, addressing GBV.
So I know that you have a PhD in social anthropology from University of St. Andrews. Did you also study a gender component in your PhD?
Yes. So initially I wanted to, my initial sort of research topic was around looking at masculinities in relation to gender-based violence in an urban setting. So I did about 15 months of field work in an urban settlement in Port Moresby, and the thesis ended up being an ethnography of urban life. But there's a chapter in my thesis around gender relations and addressing gender-based violence through the eyes of the community that I lived in. To put it simply that way, yes.
And have you also studied gender-based violence, between Polynesians, Melanesians, Micronesians, and what the differences might be in the different regions? Like, are there unique challenges?
So I've been involved in previous research looking at addressing gender-based violence across the region. So a few years ago, I was involved in a filmmaking project that looked at how film can address gender-based violence. And this was a project that involved researchers from PNG, from Samoa, from the UK, and we went across the island hopping. So we started in PNG and we went to Vanuatu, Solomon's, Vanuatu, came to Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. And so And I've had an opportunity during that time to understand some of the nuances around GBV, and I'm saying GBV in the broadest sense because we know that domestic violence is the most prevalent kind of violence against women, but there are other forms of violence that are gendered in nature. And I think one of the key things, and also from the work that I've done here at the forum, that I recognize clearly is that the issue of domestic violence or gender-based violence is one that's of concern across the regions. So all across, maybe a different scale. So like in my own country, because we're so big and it's a very diverse nation, we have the scale of violence is different. And there's some things that are unique to Papua New Guinea that maybe I know of. I haven't seen in other countries of the region, like sorcery accusation related violence, which has a gendered component. But I think my experience at working at the forum, I can see that violence against women is a concern all across the region.
Right. And because specific societies are so layered and there's so many differences in like culture and faith as well, how does faith and culture impact gender-based violence? How does it help or hurt the cause, from what you've seen in your research?
So I think there's it can do both, and you're right, Talei. It can help or hurt the cause, and I can share experience from doing research in PNG around sorcery accusation related violence, where it's very gendered in the sense that in some parts of Papua New Guinea, the accusations of sorcery predominantly against women. In other parts, it's mainly men who are accused of being sorcerers. But in generally, regardless of whether the person being accused is a man or a woman, we found that the role of the church is really important in that it can harm or help. So there are some parts of the country where they've been dealing with sorcery accusation for many years. It's part of the way we live, our worldview. And so the church, especially some of the mainline churches in the Catholic Church, has been very strong in advocating against sorcery accusation related violence. And then there are parts of the country where religious belief and faith in many ways fuels the accusation because of the way in which the Bible is interpreted as well, and Christian teachings are interpreted to in some ways align with our traditional worldview around why things happen. For example, if someone who's quite young is sick and dies and there's no cause for their death, people revert to what they know, their ways of living in our traditional societies. And I think relating to the issue of health and healthy communities where there's no where the health facilities or the education facilities are not there. Obviously, people don't have the knowledge to understand that there might be a biomedical cause. And if there are health facilities in place, they don't have the kinds of technology available to be able to diagnose an illness. So someone could be walking around with diabetes or some kind of leukemia, but because we don't have the technology available to diagnose these kinds of illnesses, they come to the health facility and they go back and forth, and then they end up dying or getting very sick. And this is in many ways people's ways of trying to justify why illness happens and why something bad happens. But that's only one kind of example. There are examples where people are, it's not nothing to do with health, but they're still accusing others for their misfortune.
Right. So I also wanted to ask, because there's such a stigma around gender-based violence in Fiji. I'm not sure how it is across the Pacific, but a lot of women who face gender-based violence don't report it when it happens because they're afraid of the public perception. In your research, have you found ways to tackle this stigma?
Yeah, Talei, I think that's a really important point. And I think that's something that I've, coming from PNG, really can see something very starkly different. And I haven't spent enough time in other Pacific countries to really be able to draw any conclusions. But certainly I've lived in Fiji for going on to 3 years now. And one of the things that I always find quite interesting is that for us in PNG, the violence, whether it's especially violence against women, it's a very public, people, it's not that people hide. People know what's going on, and people, they either choose to intervene or they don't, intervene. But we do also know that from research from the Demographic Health Survey in PNG and from research across the region that this stigma is a real issue, in the sense that people don't know want other people to know their business, but also in many cases, and I hear this from people who work in the GBV space. One of the reasons why women don't come forward is that they don't want their husbands to go to jail. So in countries like Fiji, and Talei, maybe both you and Maeva might have some thoughts around this, where you have a no-drop policy, is my understanding. This this means that anybody who comes into contact with the law, that's it, it goes now, as in the case will go. And seems to be some reluctance around women to come forward because they don't want their husbands to go through this process where they might end up in jail. And also, of course, there'll be stigma around that as well, because when a man is removed from his family, all of the other repercussions around what his family thinks. On the
Yeah,
work that I've been in PNG to address this is to find make sure that there's alternative pathways for addressing issues around gender-based violence. So we have the formal system where you go and the police comes, you press charges, so there's that system. But in many of our countries, there is also the informal justice system. So the village chiefs or the faith leaders or people like that who may be able to intervene as well. But in my view, the end result should be that we should be addressing this issue with a view to limiting and stopping the violence.
Yeah, sorry, it cut off for a little bit there for me, but I just wanted to ask, how does social media impact gender-based violence? Because I know in Fiji, and of course you've been living here for 3 years, you've probably seen how often women are bullied on Facebook and on Twitter. And I guess for everyone else who's here, we have a minister here in Fiji, a government minister. Her name's Linda Tambuya, and recently private stories of her, life outside of politics became public. And I think hundreds of people were bullying her online. They were calling her all kinds of names. People were referring to her as as a slut, as a homewrecker, and all of these other things that had nothing to do with the quality of her work. And it got so bad that people wanted her to step down. So I just wanted to ask about how social media comes into play. Like, as a researcher, do you look at social media and how much bullying is going on, and then think that it's going to become real world violence? Or does it just stay on social media?
So I thank you. And I think, so this is one of the things when we were doing the consultations for the Revitalized Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration, and we've now captured this in the Revitalized Pledge, is ensuring or looking at ensuring that gender-based violence is also catering or taking into account technology facilitated violence. And last year, SPC, our colleagues at SPC, hosted the first summit or big gathering for the region around TFGBV, because we do see that as an additional sort of thing to consider now and worry about in terms of addressing gender-based violence, because as you rightly said, Talei, it's kind of like free reign on social media. Anybody can say. You mentioned the case of Vulnerable Linda Tambuya. At the moment, I've noticed in the last 24 hours, there's a lot of talk about this Tongan woman who's made some remarks regarding the recent George Fiji also concert in Nandi around Fijians, and my understanding just from reading the kind of back and forth on social media is that she is a survivor of domestic violence. But you can see that kind of undercurrent in the way people can really become quite nasty online. And if I can just make one more point around that in relation to women in leadership. And we see this across the region where we want to have women like Linda Tambuya and others in leadership roles, especially at the highest level in politics. But we also know that women who are in politics are not just in our in the small Pacific Islands countries, but in our big PIF countries, in Australia and New Zealand included, that women who are at leadership level in politics really also have to put up with a lot of bullying and that kind of cyber-related harassment.
Right. And I also wanted to ask, how does social media bullying affect girls' education, or how does it affect women in the workplace? Have you conducted any research in that area?
I haven't been able to really look into that, but I can, just by looking at the papers here in Fiji, I can see not just women, but I've, seen a few cases in the last year where there was young men who committed suicide over bullying. And we've had one case in Papua New Guinea where a young girl, a teenager, committed suicide because of bullying. You see, in the workplace, I think there's opportunities to address this kind of thing through workplace policy. It's really outside of work that there's not enough there's no way to really, you can't control what people say on the media. It's any man for himself kind of thing.
Do you think there are government policies that can be implemented, to challenge social media bullying?
I think, I mean, I know a few years ago, Nauru actually banned Facebook. And my understanding is that it was banned, and this was seen in some ways as, curtailing people's freedom of speech. But my understanding is the thinking behind that happening was that there was this kind of what we're just talking about. I think there was some kind of picture, harassment of women or sharing of pictures of girls inappropriately, and the government took action as a way to try and also socialize and sensitize their own people about what a social media platform like Facebook can do, which is detrimental. I don't know how long the ban went on for, and they've got Facebook back in that country now, but that's more like that's an extreme where government has come in. But I think where there's opportunity for IT, better security or those kinds of things to help to ensure that bullies are tracked down, and not just bullies, but that's one thing. But we're also living in a time where transactions happen in terms of transnational crimes that may or may not include trafficking of women and girls or children. And if the laws around cybersecurity are able to be strengthened within the region, and that's work that is ongoing, and also what our security team works on, that would be useful for our women and girls.
You mentioned the sharing of inappropriate pictures, and there has been a rise in cases of revenge porn in the Pacific. Yeah. Do you know of any Pacific countries that are, making legislation to fight this? Is there work being done, with organizations like PIFs?
So with PIFs, we like our work, we don't often, unless we're asked, we go to support at the national level. But when we convene or we attend convenings that are at the regional level, a lot of times we learn about the work that's already ongoing in our region, in our countries. There are several countries, I believe, that are working on legislation relating to this kind of revenge pornography and sharing of inappropriate photos. In Papua New Guinea, there is law in place. And so it's those who are sharing those pictures, because a lot of those pictures are not pornography per se. They're personal photos that have been leaked onto the internet. So it's really those who are sharing these pictures that really need to be held accountable, as opposed to those who are in the pictures. And it's often girls, young girls. But to answer your question, yes, there are several countries. I know from that meeting that was held last year that there was a number of countries who are working on legislation.
Right. And is there a difference between the percentage of women and girls who face gender-based violence in, Polynesia compared to Melanesia and Micronesia? Do you find it's higher in Melanesia?
It is higher than Melanesia, but I think also we've got to be mindful that reporting rates, and Melanesia, as in the sub-region, is very big. The countries of Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, New Caledonia, the population itself is big. But we have some of our countries where legislation has been, all of the countries of the Pacific, the legislation has been in place for many years, but countries like Fiji have really led the response to addressing gender-based violence, and through the Fiji Women's Crisis Center, and then they've gone on to support other networks in the region, like the Vanuatu Women's Crisis Center. They've supported work in PNG and in Tonga. And so the numbers in the Melanesian sub-region are big, large, but it's also because they're the largest countries. But again, the reporting is there, and we're not sure whether, well, it's not that we're not sure, but we know that not everybody comes through the formal system. So what you're seeing in those numbers are really those who come in contact with the law. There's a big number of women and girls, no doubt, who don't even come in contact with the formal legal system.
You mentioned Fiji Women's Crisis Center, which is a very big nonprofit in Fiji and probably the main response to, victims of gender-based violence. How have national and international NGOs empowered women and girls who face gender-based violence? How important is their role in the Pacific?
I think that's a really excellent question, and I think it's something that now that Pacific women themselves or Pacific people need to self-reflect on really what the role of international NGOs and development partners have been. There, in many ways, the impact has been very positive in that, especially with development partners, as a lot of our small NGOs don't have the kind of resourcing to be able to carry out work. But having said that, given the nature of our societies and our communities, we're very family-based, clan and kin-based groups. Much of what has been advocated in terms of the support for addressing gender-based violence has come from a very Western lens. It's very individualistic. It doesn't take into account that some communities come together as a group to talk and resolve these kind of issues. We've been sort of pitted up as it's an individual right to life, to freedom, to safety, without really recognizing the context in which women in our societies live, in that they are part of a family themselves, a clan, they marry into someone else's family, they're part of a faith group, in the relationships between, in some of our societies, the mothers, brothers are very important male figures, and how they play a role also in the lives of girls. All of this kinship, our kinship and our ways of living as specific people, sometimes we come up when we try to engage with the donor and development partner speak, we start to rub up, and you can see the friction, because we are doing one thing one way because that's the way with the rights are very individual based. This is how we should do this to address this issue, but in our reality, it's very different. And I'm saying this about the rural, remote women, not necessarily women in urban settings, but the women in our islands and in the mountains, they don't think about the police as the first option. Some of these countries, there are no police there. So they've got to go to their cultural leaders or their faith leaders to help them to solve their issues or address some of the issues relating to gender-based violence.
So I've noticed that most of the organizations that deal with gender-based violence rush to help the women in need. They look for programs to help them, or workshops, or anything else that can support their emotional well-being. But is there any hope for rehabilitation for the men who commit violence?
I think that this is one thing, again, through the work that I've done here at the forum and work that of other people, women and men in the region, that it's got to be a holistic approach, that men who are perpetrators of violence, their behavior has also got to be addressed, and it's got to be done in a way that is not confronting and will cause more harm, the do no harm principle. Because as I mentioned, a lot of these women just want the violence to stop. And if for it to stop, it's got to be the man's behavior that changes, because they are the ones who are the perpetrators of the violence. But there's not enough work done in this space to be able to really engage with men and ensure that we have culturally appropriate perpetrator programs. There is bits and pieces of work that have been done in the Male Advocacy Network, but I think there's more opportunities to really address gender-based violence through ensuring the inclusive participation of men and boys in this journey.
Do you think we need to change the language instead of calling it gender-based violence? Should we call it, men's violence against women?
Not necessarily, because gender-based violence is kind of inclusive of all. Because we also know that there's violence that is caused by women. In countries like PNG, where it's customary, where you can have more than one wife, there's those kinds of contexts where violence is gendered, whether it's co-wives fighting or wives fighting their husband or things like that. And so gender-based violence speaks to violence at the broadest sense, because again, there's also, while we're speaking to it in terms of men and women, there's also the very contentious issue of the being inclusive of LGBTQI plus communities as well.
And have you personally witnessed, men who have committed violence become rehabilitated, change their ways? And how did they do this? Did they go through the church, or was there another way, an alternative way for them?
I know of personally myself of men who have changed. And I think for me, for those who have observed change, it's been in their own family system. Part of it's because of church, yes, going into the church and ensuring and really trying to be committed to Lotu church, but also in one instance, women who have had daughters. I think that has been an eye-opener in the sense that, okay, if this is how I treat my wife or the mother of my child, this same child this little girl is going to grow up to be somebody's wife, So that's what I mean by the drawing on the kinship and our own, the way we think about the world. I think there is not enough work in looking at causes of violence. If there was a longitudinal study done around violence, really tracking, because there's evidence now sort of coming through that men who have witnessed violence as children tend to perpetrate violence against women as adults, right? And I think there's a need for that kind of study as well, to see how Pacific men who have grown up as or survivors of violence, seen their mothers being beaten, how they, as adults, whether they go down that same path or they go down a different trajectory. So I think that's an opportunity definitely for more research to engage with, because we don't have that kind of information at hand.
So in Fiji, on social media, Maeva, correct me if you think this is wrong. On social media, when people become famous because they're victims of gender-based violence, when women become famous and everyone's sharing their posts and things like that, a lot of people tend to not believe them. a lot of people tend to blame them and, share their posts and say, this woman is lying. I know the man, he's a very nice guy. He's so polite. And how would you tackle that issue, when it comes to the public not believing the victim?
So, Talei, just say again, for victim blaming on social media.
Yeah,
If
there's
I
so
can,
much victim blaming
Mm.
there's so much victim blaming that happens in Fiji on social media. If a case becomes public, people find out who the victim
Yeah.
is, they'll discuss it on social media. And because Fiji is such a small country, of course, the victim, her whole family would be reading this.
Yeah, I think again, these are the kinds of challenges that women face in wanting to come out and speak about their stories. And with social media, that's an added kind of burden for them in many ways. And it also comes back to our own how we think about this issue, victim blaming in the sense that, anything, whether she asked for it or she didn't do this the right way or whatever. And a victim blaming is not something that's new. It's just that now social media allows everybody to have that conversation. Whereas before, when we had no social media, people still victim blame, but it's in your own family group. Okay, this happened to your sister-in-law, and people go and talk here and say, oh, she didn't do that. That's why she got a beating. And while I'm on that point, can I just also speak to that issue around victim blaming and the way and the gendered roles? Again, speaking in the context of the Pacific, there's certain roles, and especially when you're married into a family, that there's expectations that you will do. And these are the things that rub up against. I mean, I don't know, Mary, your experience in Vanuatu, where there's certain things that when you marry into a family, they expect that out of the brother, wife, and you're, for example, married to the eldest son or something, that the wife of this brother will do these things and be this person to that family.
Yeah, the saying is that if you're married the whole entire extended family.
That's the one. That's the one. And so I think in this kind of modern day Pacific that we live in, where families are now in some, especially in this urban setting, we're living more nuclear, it's also pressure on these men to be able to manage these kinds of expectations from their families, that they might not want that their wife to be married to the whole entire extended family, and there's any customary obligation, she has to be there. But again, in some of our societies, the mothers and sisters are very, very powerful figures in their brothers and sons' lives. And this is something I always say in my own country to my own fellow Papua New Guinean women. We say it in Tokpisin, we say, look out in mouse blow you. Look after your mouth, because that's something you might say to your brother or your son that will like stoke the fire in him to be angry at his wife. Because if you don't want that to happen to yourself, then don't say the same thing, and then your sister-in-law, will be in some ways in threat of violence, because you, the sister and the mother, is saying, she didn't do that, or I came to your house and you didn't welcome me, or you didn't make my tea or whatever, or she stayed in the room the whole time. These are the real sort of, Desi Mary, you're laughing because you can relate to it. You know what? These are the things that are specific women now, and we're telling it. If someone else heard it, they'd be like, oh my goodness, that's so bizarre. But for us, those are the little things in Tokpisin. Again, Mary will know, we say it means passing your ways. And these are the things that we value about not just women, but people and how you relate to each other. But I think, speaking about in the context of gender-based violence, it really can have some kind of influence and effect in the way in which men also engage or think about their own wives.
So I know that in biblical teachings, which are, found across the Pacific, they're always teaching about how women submit yourselves to your husbands. But people don't seem to finish the scripture where it says, husbands, love your wives. There's such a focus on women performing within marriage and relationships in the Pacific. And I just wanted to know from your research, what the reasons are. Like, why don't people focus more on the men as well for not doing their duty of being loving husbands?
Yeah, I think it's not really the focus. I think we have talked about the submitting more than the protecting and the love. And that's something when we engage with speaking about violence with men that we should speak to more in that context. And that's the role of the church is really important for that. And I also think it's because, again, because there has been a very big focus on empowering women that we've in some ways are starting to see these very disempowered men, young men in our region. And so it's about finding the right balance and also really looking at, for example, the Bible and picking up where we haven't maybe focused a lot on the role of men and boys in the context of religion and packaging it in a way, in a positive way, because what we see in the development space is that there's a lot of opportunities for women and girls. For example, Australia gives scholarships for study in their country. Half of the scholarships must go to women. That's affirmative action. And with the theory or that, when you have an educated woman, she's empowered, she can look after herself, she can get herself out of situations of violence. I can tell you that in Papua New Guinea, the domestic demographic health survey shows that women who are highly educated are reporting violence, and the violence is from men who are educated at the same level. So it's about finding that balance. Of course, it could be that they're reporting more because they're aware of the laws, they know that the laws are in place. But I think that kind of indication in itself is something to be concerned about. And so when we talk about addressing issues relating to gender-based violence or gender equality, that's why from the perspective of the pledge and the work that we do, we must bring all of our people together, men and boys, women and girls, the elderly, the persons with disability, be very inclusive. And sometimes this can be seen that we're diluting the importance of addressing violence against women. But I think we've seen, especially with a lot of donor and development interventions, that the change can happen over time, but it's got to be consistent and it's got to be owned by the people, our own people, which means that it's got to be done in a way and framed in a way that they can also relate to.
So I know that you have a very busy schedule, Dr. Fiona, and we are running out of time. I have one more question before we open the floor to, questions from everyone who's here. How do women in the Pacific hold leadership roles beyond politics? And how do these roles differ from men's leadership roles?
Oh, fantastic. Look, women are leaders. I think that's one thing we don't see women at the political level, and there's many challenges across the region why they don't get into politics. But women are leaders at all levels. We've got some of our countries in the region where women are the owners of the land. They're matrilineal countries. Now in RMI, FSM, parts of Palau, parts of Papua New Guinea, And so they own the land. They're the leaders of their communities. We have women who are leaders in their faith-based circles, women leaders in the non-government space. And in some countries, we've got very strong women leaders in the private sector and civil society.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Fiona, for all of your insights and helping us to understand how the Bible can help or hurt gender-based violence, or even why we call it gender-based violence in the Pacific, how social media impacts it. This has been a very important discussion. And because Melanesian Women Today is rolling out more projects in Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, this discussion is very important for us, as the volunteers. So now I wanted to open up the floor and just ask anyone if you have any questions for Dr. Fiona. You can go ahead now. Maybe I could just pick someone randomly to ask a question. So I will go to our master student in Adelaide, who is training to be a psychologist. Maeva, do you have any questions for Dr. Fiona?
Well, I really like what you said about the role of churches, how it can cause harm, or it can, I forgot what you said, can cause harm or improve in terms of gender-based violence. Because I used to work for Fiji Women's Crisis Center, and we used to go and do awareness programs in the village and even in police stations. And we always get that particular Bible verse where, but women are supposed to submit to men. Women are supposed to submit to men. And I'm thankful for our colleagues that they are well aware of the Bible. So we always, bring that up like the rest of the chapters. And I don't know, I think my question is around because religion is such a respectful thing in the Pacific. People, we hold high respect for it. How, I think my question is around how can we, bring the Bible in terms of to meet that respect level, to bring that the Bible also says this, because sometimes men sees that as a threat or we're disrespecting them.
Yeah, no, I think that, there's been a lot of work being done. Thank you, Maeva, around theology of gender, and the work that the Pacific Theological College is doing. And so it's really about getting our faith leaders and the religious on board to be able to speak to the masses, because as you know, and from your experience, people listen to what the pastor or the tala says. And so where there's opportunities to engage, and this is why the places like the Pacific Theological College are so important, because they engage with theology, but they engage in academia and thinking, philosophical thinking, but are also aware, and the Pacific Council of Churches, of course, but are also aware of the real issues that confront our people, and gender-based violence is one of them. So I think there's been a lot of positive developments in that space, and something that people like yourself, Maeva, when you complete your studies, hopefully we'll be able to continue to engage.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Fiona, I know that you have a meeting at 12.
Yes.
Is that, well, thank you so very much for making time for us today. And I speak on behalf of everyone. We're so pleased to hear your insights. And you can leave whenever you feel like you have to. We don't want to keep you.
Oh, thank you. Yes, sorry, I've got another meeting to go to at 12, and I'm really sorry that I talk so much that I didn't get time to engage in some of your questions as well.
No, honestly, you made it very easy for me as the moderator. I really appreciate when people talk.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Fiona.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Fiona.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And all the best. Hopefully we can chat again later another time.
Yes, we will
Thank you so
definitely have
much.
you back to talk to us. And in the meantime, if
Thank you.
anybody wants to go ahead and ask the question, Talei and me and Maver, she has worked with the Women's Crisis Center in Fiji, so she's very familiar with the issues. And I think a lot of times they want to know more about the Pacific Island background, especially when it comes to girls, since we've, some of our questions may want to relate around the girls. And Maver and Talei are also really good because they have experience in being a Pacific Island girl. So Sage, Sire, or Liz, what are some of the questions that you guys might feel like? Of course, you know me. So Talei and Maver are right here. You guys might have some. We've heard from Fiona. She's obviously work around research and all that. And she's from the Melanesian region in Papua New Guinea, which they have the biggest population. But Fiji seems to be leading in terms of tackling, as you heard Talei talk about, gender-based violence. And they've helped a lot of other Pacific Island nations like Vanuatu and others like the Solomon Islands. And we would hear from them when we have our upcoming webinar. So yeah, any questions you guys might want to ask, go ahead.
I had one question that I'm kind of curious about on like more of a social level, like within like communities and cultures, like if discussing like people's experiences of gender-based violence, if that's something that's like very taboo amongst other women, or if it's something that's like almost like been normalized or something that's seen as kind of acceptable to talk about. I'm just kind of curious like what that dynamic is like.
I'll give that to Maver or Talei.
Yeah, no, I was going to direct it to Mava.
Well, in my experience, people do talk about it, but then at the same time, there's fear of being victimized in the, so people don't really like get deeper into it because it's either they are victimized or they are make fun of. Like, oh yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's in my personal experience so far and what I've seen. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in Pacific culture, well, in Fijian culture, we laugh at everything.
Yeah.
And we laugh at very traumatic things.
Yeah.
So if someone has a near-death experience, they just need to survive, and we will laugh about it. We will make fun of them. They might get a new nickname from the experience. And that's why it makes it really hard to have these conversations about gender-based violence, because people do make fun of it quite a lot.
And from the experience of Vanuatu, and I think some of you guys have heard Dr. Jimmy talk the last time when we had a webinar. It is still a very taboo subject, and it's really, really hard, really, really hard to try and have conversation around just even like the, mental health, something like that. But women are coming, I think they're stronger in numbers. They're finding their voices in numbers. Like Talei said, sometimes you're made fun of as a young girl. You can be made fun of, even your brothers as well, they'll make fun of you. And so you grow up as a young girl, you really have to figure out how to develop a thick skin. And so your cousins or a best friend could be your network of how do you try to work all these things out. And I'll just speak from the experience of my mom, because she has experienced violence as well. So what she's done, because we talk a lot about this, and she's like, they build a network among each other, the mothers and cousins and sisters from a very, very early age. Because they don't know, because the way that we solve problem is like having a communal meeting. So if there is a problem in the family, the chiefs get to be brought into, into the village, and then everybody comes to hear the problem or hear the dispute, and kind of that's how problems are solved. So when it comes to intimate relationships between a husband and wife or things like that, there are certain settings of it depending on what island you're from. But in general, yeah, it's one of those things that women and girls particularly have a really, really hard time. But again, like gender-based violence, like Dr. Fiona talks about, it also can happen to, the women could also be doing the violence to the men as well, especially by talking and, adding on to making things more even worse. Yeah.
I had a question too, if you guys are done answering. Dr. Fiona talked about like how there can be a cycle with like men like growing up seeing domestic abuse and then like growing up to maybe commit it. Is there a cycle with women being abused, like getting used to that relationship because they see that in their parents, and so they're like, oh, that's like acceptable? Is it ever seen as like acceptable, or is it always seen as like, you know?
Once again, I'm going to direct this question to Maeva.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, because even research has shown there's not much research in the West and in the Pacific, but even in the Western culture, the research shows that women who were raised up in a violence home, they tend to normalize that, and they think that it's a normal thing that they go through violence. And I think that's what's happening at home as well, because Fiji is a patriarchy culture and man is always leading. And so when women go through that violence, go through gender-based violence, it's often seen as normal, or it's seen as like a disciplinary that they are in the wrong. So it's for them to go back in track on what their role as a woman and what they're supposed to be doing. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
So it's a perpetuating cycle. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's probably not just in the Pacific. I think it's a human psychological trauma that happens.
Yeah.
And, it's just a cycle of that thing. Unfortunately, a lot of the islands, Fiji is a little bit more advanced in terms of like counseling and things like that. I know Vanuatu has none. When I was working with World Vision, we have no one who's a counselor. And so they create like all this little groups where you can sit and talk. I mean, some of this violence are like really bad. So sometimes I just feel so sorry for these women. You don't know how, even the young girls. Yeah, so a lot to work on.
My wife is laughing at me, but I was just going to share a story when I was a teacher in Vanuatu, and we asked the girl students, last night a certain woman got beat up by her husband, and do you think that's right? And the response from all the girls was, well, what did she do? And if you think about that, it really, I mean, it's kind of sad, right? That they believe that there's some things that can happen where it's okay if that is a result. And, granted, that was a long time ago now when I was there, but I have been back to Vanuatu several times, and I don't think it's changed very much, to be honest.
I'm sure you're dying to ask a question, Liz.
Well, I'm kind of thinking about like what's the culturally, I mean, it's really interesting. I'm learning so much. And to hear you speak about faith and religious-based responses to it. And I guess I'm really thinking about like what is the culturally appropriate response or action, if you will, because that's the way I think, right? What I know I can't solve the problem, but what is the culturally appropriate way to address or attend to the problem?
Ray and Mayra, you guys can answer it, and I'll send everybody an article which is to do with culture.
Right. Maeva, correct me if you think I'm wrong. But it really differs from family to family because some I'm talking about Indigenous Fijian families. In some families, if their sister or their cousin is beaten up, they might send their sons to attack the perpetrator, who is the husband or the boyfriend. I've actually witnessed this many times, where they go to the house, they beat them up really badly, they see it as like they're teaching them a lesson. And then I've also seen in some cases where the family wants to hide the abuse for the sake of appearances, because in Fijian culture, appearances are very important. Staying married is extremely important, being married gives you a different status. So yeah, Maeva, please add to that.
Yeah, I agree with Talei, and especially if you're married to a chiefly house or in a culture where they have high status in the province or in the village, that could mean a lot. Like they might the woman's family might ask you to go back. But in terms of cultural response, I think Fiji Women's Crisis Center is doing like a really good job with counseling. And there's a lot more other organizations coming up like Empower Pacific. They're really good. I think one of the thing that I might be a bit not really support, or I don't know how to put it in words, but I think me and Dr. Mary spoke about this, about contextualizing counseling, because normally those organizations, they do face-to-face counseling. So that's a Western model of counseling. But in our culture, when we share stories, we sit outside and we do things like that. And I attended a workshop with an organization that looks after asylum seekers here in Australia. And they were talking about the importance of contextualizing counseling. And I think that's one thing that in the Pacific that we really need to look at. Like we need to get rid, because there's a very power imbalance in the face-to-face. And in the Pacific, we are taught to, to respect people, authority figures. And when someone comes, especially a victim of DV, when they come into that face-to-face counseling, they're further, what do you call this? They're like forced to respect the counselor, because in counseling you have to be at the same level. But because of that, there's like that great power imbalance, which I think that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, so I think a long time ago I said if we just focus on Melanesia just right now, because that's where we work. The thing about Melanesia, which we will have more discussion with experts, will come in and talk more about the complexity of Melanesian culture. Again, Liz, whenever you talk about issues in Melanesia, you can never seem to walk away and not look at culture, because everybody lives in that. That's how they think, that's how they do things. And Maeva is just saying about the imbalance, because there is this, everything is processed around relationship. And so whenever there's a relationship and there is the relationship between, say, for instance, me and my older brother, there is a different level of respect or relationship and versus my younger brother. So that there's so much nuances in so much of this thing. So that's why for me, I often think about this, like how do we as a small organization do something very different by start to unpacking all of this a little different, because we're now focusing on Solomon Islands, we're focusing on Papua New Guinea, we focus on Vanuatu. And then if we look at working with young women and scholarships or whatever else areas, we cannot overlook the issues that are happening. And a lot of time, you will find that it goes back to the underbelly of there's violence, there's abuse, there's, you name it. It's just so stacked up within those complex nuances that have just, of this young girls are sitting within it. So the problems, you can't just take one form of problem and say, okay, a solution and say, okay, this is how we're going to solve it. So we will have to look at Solomon differently. We have to look at Vanuatu differently. We have to look at Papua New Guinea differently. I know it's exhausting. It's like, oh my gosh, way too much for me to unpack. So,
I mean, I really appreciate and respect the idea that the church's authority, right? I mean, she was speaking that it can be helpful or harmful. And the helpful part of it to me is really fascinating. And to hear you say, Maeva, that like there's so much respect for it, right? So I'm just thinking in terms of like what other institutions, and you're talking about the nonprofit organizations that are helping with these situations. And that's why I'm asking about like culturally responsive ways to address it. And I do understand, like in terms of all of the different cultures, you have to address it differently in each situation. But I guess I was just sort of wondering, besides the church, which seems like it could actually be helpful, what other venues or avenues would there be, if that makes sense? I mean, I think that has been answered, but that's kind of what I meant.
So I'll give a quick example for Vanuatu. The other institutions or elements of this is in the Pacific, you'll have, the women's affairs or councils or whatever you can call it. Then you have the youth, you have to have the church, and then you have the chiefs. When we talk about Melanesia, the chiefs becomes one of the components, because that's kind of like how our cultures are set up. So the chiefs are supposed to be also part of the solution when it comes to cultures. And sometimes they either do their work or they don't do their work. Remember that most of these chiefs are male. So you're stuck between this, two rock. It's like, okay, so that's why a lot of times with the women councils or the other groups, we have to involve the chiefs into our discussions, because they will have to be able to carry out. And I think Talei had asked Dr. Fiona about men's behavior as well. Like they need to recognize their behavior. So that church can come in and do that too, as well as being like if we were to work with a church and say, hey, we have this program, how can we implement? So then we bring the chiefs into the discussions. So we give them that component for them to go, and we give the youth a component, that kind of thing. So that can also be a way that, because everybody understands how the culture works. And then the chiefs kind of be the leader in how to, especially in the community, because the chief is the leader of their community or their village, depending on where you are. So I'm going to leave it to Talei and Maeva to take.
Yeah, just adding on to that, Liz. So in my experience, my work experience with Fiji Women's Crisis Centers, we not only work with domestic victims of domestic violence, we also go into village, go into schools, and we target young males. We do awareness programs for men in the villages and young boys in schools, in different schools. And we also target institutions, workplaces like the police, because a lot of this victimization too can also be coming from them. So we try to target them as well. Yeah, like Dr. Mara said, like chiefs, village headmen, because in the Melanesian culture, we are taught to respect authoritative figures. And so in our in my work with FWCC, we always target the people with authority in villages, and so they could be an influence to the men that that looks up to them. We also work because in Fiji, we love rugby so much. So sometimes we target the rugby players so that they could be an ambassador. So yes, those are some of the cultural things that we do.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah.
Talei, do you have any additional input on that?
I guess I would just add that like you're saying, Dr. Mara, chiefs are extremely important in Fiji. And Maeva, correct me if I'm wrong, we only have one high chief who is a woman, Rotamumo Kepa. Apart from her, the only people who can advocate against, gender-based violence are all men, and many of them are extremely conservative. And like Mr. Savic was talking about how people in Vanuatu would ask, what did the woman do or say that led to the violent act being committed? In Fiji, a lot of, or maybe some chiefs do perpetuate this kind of thinking. So I think one way we could target that is by consulting with chiefs, constantly, so that maybe they can change the way that they feel. And I'm saying this, I come from a chiefly family myself. On our island of Batiki, my dad is going to be the next Toranimba, which is the next high chief, but he's also against gender-based violence and all forms of violence against women. And so because of that, he's been such an encouraging person, to women in our family, in our island. And it really has changed a lot of people's perspectives, because I do have cousins who beat up their wives, and he's always, the first person to be against them or to advocate for their wives. And because he steps in, you can see that the whole family seems to change their perceptions, and people don't ask, what did the wife do anymore?
Thank you, Talei.
Thank
That
you.
was really good.
Yeah. Thank you
it's
for sharing that.
encouraging.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing is, we can't work in isolation, and like it's like just exactly how Dr. Fiona was talking about that. That's the thing that rubs, against, like, no, we can't use this. This is not going to happen. You got to work as a community of different networks, of different entities that are already established, and something that the people are used to and know and are easy to reach out. So in Vanuatu, we have women's centers in all the villages. So they know that this is what they can go to. This is their chiefs, and they do have their, they know what we call Nasara, which is like the meeting house, but they can go to and report, something happened. So those, if we were to work in Vanuatu, Solomons, we have to ask Ruth, for instance, because that's what she does too. How do we go about this? And so she will lead us into the different things that we can learn and work with them, because it's not just a one-person job, it's everybody's job, basically, but doing it in the context, like Maeva was saying, in different countries that we work in. So as we continue to help our girls in the Solomon Islands or wherever, just kind of keep that in the back of our mind, that these girls, this is what they deal with every single day. It's not like you grew up in I grew up in that too. It's like an ongoing thing. And Jason, he's witnessed it, he's seen it. Of course, Liz was a Peace Corps volunteer too. I'm sure she has some experience in, that kind of in where she served. But that's something that we're trying so hard. And I think that for MWT, working with women and girls, you cannot just do it in isolation. That's just part of the job that comes with that. Because first of all, we're going to say, are they okay? In order for them to finish high school. Are they okay, or they're just going to quit halfway because they're experiencing violence at home, because their mom's experiencing violence at home, that kind of thing. So, yeah. Yeah, so it's almost
Thank you. Yeah,
5:30. Yeah,
appreciate it.
yeah. Oh, here we go.
I would love to hear the Fiji perspective on what I see in Vanuatu, and that is, and it's mostly people in town, like people who live in the city, but I see a lot of men who are torn because they're expected to adopt a Western lifestyle, which means that they have to get a job and earn money. And then their family has a lot of expectations on them. And it kind of it expands to the village as well because school fees are kind of universal. So a lot of people have to, pay school fees, which that in itself involves money, which means if you're in a village, you have to have some way to earn money. And that well, wait, let me just say, as opposed to that, if you were just living in a village and you were living your life and you didn't have to pay for school fees, the judge maybe of a good man would be, how much taro did you plant? How much cassava did you plant? How much, are you taking care of your family because of your garden? Um, and I see way too many people conflicted between, well, this is my village or cultural life versus this is the Western expectation as to how I'm supposed to behave and stuff like that. And I see a lot of people getting frustrated because they're not educated to get these really good jobs. To be honest, there really isn't enough really good jobs. Um, they are networked so they can't get into that, you know, life that they dreamed of when they moved to the big city. And I think that a lot of the frustration that those men feel uh comes from that Western perspective. And to me personally, it feels like for a lot of the people that I see living, my perspective is from Port Vila, and I feel like for a lot of those people, I feel like saying to them, you should move back to the village and just plant a garden and have a wife and children, and your life will be pretty good. But for whatever reason, they don't do that. So, and I would suspect because Fiji has way more jobs and way more opportunities for people, because you have Fiji, you have Suva, you have Nandi, all the resorts. There's like lots of opportunities for people there. I would love to hear the perspective because I feel like men get frustrated, and I'm afraid that that frustration is what leads to the violence that we're talking about.
I'm so sorry. Hang on. This is so interesting, but I have to head out. I was actually supposed to head out 30 minutes ago. But thank you so much. It was really nice to see you all.
Thank you, Sage.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Sage.
So maybe I can start with the response to Mr. Savik's question, and then maybe you can add on. So I did some research for Australian National University. I had a contract with them, and it was environmental research and also gender
research in 3 villages around Fiji. So we found that in islands in Lomaiviti, my province, because women can weave mats, women actually, in a lot of cases, women actually make money for the family. And then, like Mr. Savik is saying, like the men have farms, they go fishing. And so we found that when they came to Suva, our capital city, they also found a way to make that dynamic work. So we would have these families where the woman is the breadwinner, but nobody ever considered it breadwinner. Like they never labeled their tasks. And then the men would go fishing. They would, bring in food. They would farm in the backyard, and they adapted quite well in these cases. But then we went to places in the highlands where women don't weave mats or baskets because it's not a customary thing to do. Their ancestors were not making mats in certain places in Ba or Tavua. And the men seem to be a lot more strict with their wives, and they when they moved to the city, they were very stressed about making money, and because these gender roles were not really shared, whereas in places like my province, where women are a little bit more independent because they can make mats and things like that, it seems like they have a little bit more equality.
Yes, just adding on to that. So Mr. Savik, you mentioned like, why is it hard for them to go back? I think because right now we've been learning about in uni about intergenerational trauma in abroad with Aborigines people, and kind of make me relate back to home, because I think your question goes back to internal colonialism, where we have that idea that living in the city is better. It means good life. It means having knowledge, being advanced, when people don't realize that what in the village can contribute to a lot more. I think last week there was this young boy, probably 19 or 20 years old, in Fiji. He came all the way from the interior. He came to the city, bought his 4-wheel drive, and went back. And then he posted, and I think I don't know if it was him or somebody else. And then he was posting it on Facebook, how the land can bring so much. And then he was encouraging people. But I think because of internal colonialism, that idea, people tend to not go back. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I can say to my parents' experience, because they were both brought up in the village. I was brought up in the village as well. But what happens when the missionaries came, what they've done is they've forced people into schooling. And so my mom left her village when she was 4 years old. And she had to, basically, they got all those little kids, 4 to 5 years old, and put them on a boat and ship them across to the other side of the island to a mission school. And so the idea is that, you beat the whatever out of them, so they become educated and they become more westernized, and they cut their hair and they sew up their pants, and so she was brought up in that, and so was my dad. So they both brought up in this idea that you have to work hard, you have to have an education. In order to do that, you have to leave your parents at a very early age. I mean, that's how I was put in a plane at the age of 14, and been told to go to New Zealand and stay there until Christmas and then come back, because that's what you have to do. And so, like Maeva was saying, it becomes people people they take that on as that's kind of like, you've been privileged. If you get a good education, if you have nice cars, you are seen as the king of the village. So that's kind of your worth. And so it gets to the point where people start selling their land for a worth of nothing. So in some places where, like, calling somebody a doctor, it's like a huge thing. I mean, they would bow down to you. It's insane. So it's insane, this idea. But so then my dad would have this, because he was brought up in a very strict missionary home where you have to follow the rules. Like the Bible says this, and the Bible says this, and the Bible says this, and the Bible says, or you'll go to hell if you don't do all of that kind of stuff. And so they stayed in town, and that was it. They never went back to the islands. And so because I was the only one that was brought up in the village, I understand that it's, your traditions are very important. Other half of my siblings, they don't see it as very important. So you have this ongoing internal trauma, like Maeve was saying. I remember being spanked my little hands because we were still singing the national anthem to the Queen. If you don't, they spank you. Cut your hair. Every day you have to get your fingers inspected. So there's this internal things that happen. So it keeps people in this attraction of thinking that if you have nice pants, if you have a phone, if you can speak a little bit of English, then you're smart. So that's part of it. So I think there's a lot of things going on at the same time that it's really, really hard to put a finger on specifically what, just one reason to keep, the men from not stop hitting their wives. There's a lot of it, a lot of different things. Yeah. It's a lot to think about. Yeah. But I'm glad we're doing this, because this is the kind of a good start for us, because when we look at these girls that we sponsor, we do the work that we do, you got to think about that this is the kind of thing that they're brought up. And for instance, let's talk about the Solomon Islands, for instance. They're not only still under the British colony, they still, they have internal wars that have gone and have really, really done a lot of damage to, especially in Malaita, where we work. So that's something that we haven't even touched on. And some of these girls come from very, very broken homes because of family division, because of that. Not only that, but for churches as well. Churches can actually divide in all the Pacific Islands. Churches has really divided all of us, sometimes to the point where you've been excommunicated from your family because you eat pig and pig is taboo to eat or something like that, or yeah. So I know this is so much to think about.
Yeah. Dr. Mary, I'm really sorry. May I be excused? I just had something
Okay.
to attend.
Thank you so much, Vinaka.
Thank you so much, guys.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank
I
you.
I have to head out too.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yay. Okay, we'll just say bye-bye to everybody.
Oh, okay.
And the health team will meet up again I think it's on Thursday next week. With you guys are going to be planning on the webinar.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Okay, guys. Thank you so
Okay,
much,
thank you.
Talei.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thank you. Hi.